I knew something was wrong the second I walked into the community garden that morning. There's a certain hum you get used to when you work with bees, a gentle, consistent buzz that tells you all is well in their world. But that Tuesday morning in late May, the silence hit me like a physical blow. "Oh, no, no, no," I muttered, picking up my pace as I approached the apiary section of our garden. From 10 feet away, I could already see them, hundreds of tiny corpses scattered across the ground in front of the hives. I dropped my coffee, not even flinching as the hot liquid splashed against my jeans. The entrance board of the first hive was littered with dead bees, their wings splayed at unnatural angles. Classic neurotoxin response. The second hive was the same. By the time I reached the fourth hive, my hands were shaking with rage. "Jesus, Mike! What happened to them?" I turned to see Ellie, one of the garden volunteers, standing behind me with a watering can frozen in midair. "Someone killed them," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm despite the fury building inside me. "And I'm going to find out who—" "Should we call the police?" Ellie asked, her eyes wide as she took in the scale of the massacre. "Oh, we absolutely will," I said, already pulling out my phone. "But first, I need to collect samples." See, what the person who did this didn't know is that I'm not just some random guy who likes bees. I'm Dr. Michael Chen, head of the State Apiary Lab. I've got a PhD in entomology with a specialization in honeybee health, and I've testified in court as an expert witness in cases of colony collapse and pesticide misuse. Basically, they picked the wrong bee nerd to mess with. I rushed back to my house, just a 5-minute walk from the garden, and grabbed my field kit. Unlike most of my neighbors in the Oak Ridge Estates subdivision, I didn't have a pristine, magazine-worthy home office. Mine looked like a cross between a laboratory and a natural history museum, with microscopes, specimen jars, and bee-related paraphernalia covering every surface. The McMansions of Oak Ridge Estates weren't my style, but the 6-acre community garden had sealed the deal when I was house hunting after my divorce 2 years ago. I'd convinced the HOA to allow the installation of 4 beehives last spring, and until today, it had been a peaceful coexistence. As I collected dead bees and soil samples from around the hives, I cataloged the evidence methodically, my scientific training temporarily overriding my emotions. The smell gave it away immediately. A distinctive chemical odor that shouldn't be anywhere near a residential area. I was labeling the last sample container when a police cruiser pulled up to the garden entrance. The officer who approached was young, maybe mid-20s, and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "You reported vandalism?" he asked, notepad in hand. "Yes. Someone destroyed 4 honeybee colonies with what appears to be industrial-grade pesticide." He looked at the hives, then back at me. "So someone killed your bugs?" I took a deep breath. These aren't just bugs. Their managed honeybee colonies were thousands of dollars, not counting the environmental impact. "Right. And you think someone murdered them?" The way he emphasized murdered made it clear he thought I was overreacting. "Deliberately killed protected beneficial insects using what I suspect is a restricted-use pesticide. Yes," I corrected him. "That's destruction of property at minimum, and potentially a violation of state environmental regulations." The officer, his nameplate read Jenkins, scratched his head. "Okay, sir. I'll take your statement, but I should tell you up front that this isn't exactly a high-priority case." For the next 15 minutes, I gave him the rundown while he took minimal notes and tried not to look bored. After he left with a half-hearted promise to look into it, I knew I was on my own. That night, I took my samples to the lab. Benefits of being the boss. No one questions you running tests after hours. The chromatography confirmed my suspicions. Whoever killed my bees had used a commercial-grade neonicotinoid pesticide that required special licensing. This wasn't someone grabbing a can of Raid from Home Depot. This was premeditated bee murder with a controlled substance. As I drove home, mentally reviewing who in the neighborhood might have access to such chemicals, a conversation from last month's HOA meeting floated back to me. Item 5 on the agenda, concerns about the community garden beehives. Franklin Pierce, our HOA president, had announced with the gravity of someone discussing nuclear disarmament. I'd straightened in my uncomfortable folding chair, instantly alert. This wasn't on the agenda they'd emailed out. Karen Willows has asked to speak on this matter, Franklin continued, nodding to a woman in the front row who was already half standing in anticipation. Karen Willows. Of course. She had moved to the neighborhood 8 months ago and had been appointed to the HOA board almost immediately. In that short time, she had successfully lobbied to ban street parking overnight, forced 3 families to repaint their non-conforming front doors, and gotten the previous garden coordinator kicked out over native plantings she'd called weeds. These beehives are a menace, Karen started, turning to face the 20 or so residents in attendance rather than the board, always playing to the audience. My grandson got stung last week while visiting. He's only 6 years old. What if he'd been allergic? I raised my hand, and Franklin nodded at me. I'm sorry about your grandson, Karen, but those were wasps, not honeybees, I said, keeping my tone professional despite the eye roll I was suppressing. Different insect entirely. Honeybees rarely sting unless their hive is threatened, and they're not aggressive toward humans. I'd be happy to give you a field guide if you'd like to learn the difference. Karen's face flushed. I know what stung my grandson, Mr. Chen, and regardless, those hives don't belong in a residential area. They're bringing down property values. Actually, I countered, community gardens with apiaries have been shown to increase property values. I can provide several case studies. The point is, Karen interrupted, many residents are concerned. Something needs to be done before someone gets seriously hurt. After 20 more minutes of back and forth, the meeting ended with the board promising to review the situation, but taking no immediate action. As people filed out, Karen brushed past me with a tight smile. This isn't over, she murmured. An older resident named Walter hung back to walk out with me. Watch out for her, he warned. She's got a vendetta against anything that doesn't fit her vision of perfect suburban living. I'm not worried, I'd told him. The bees aren't hurting anyone, and they're technically on agricultural zoned land within the development. Walter had shaken his head. Just keep an eye out. She doesn't play fair. Now staring at the chemical analysis of my murdered bees, Walter's warning echoed in my head. I pulled up the community directory on my phone and scrolled to the Willows entry. Karen Willows, real estate agent. Dave Willows, owner of Willows Landscaping and Lawn Care. Landscaping, lawn care, the kind of business that would have access to commercial-grade pesticides. Well, 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 I muttered to my empty car. Isn't that interesting? The next morning I called my buddy, Marco, who helped maintain the irrigation system in the community garden. Hey man, sorry about your bees, he said when he picked up. That's seriously messed up. Thanks. Quick question. You ever work with Willows Landscaping? Dave Willows? Yeah, we've crossed paths on a few projects. Why? I explained my suspicion that someone had used professional-grade pesticide on my hives. Look, Marco said, his voice dropping. I've worked with Dave before. His crew sprays everything that moves. No way they're following proper application guidelines. But Dave himself? He seems like an okay guy, just cutting corners to save cash like everyone else in the business. You think his wife would have access to their supply shed? Marco laughed. Are you kidding? She runs their office. She has the keys to everything. But Mike, be careful with this. If they did use restricted pesticides illegally, they could be in serious trouble, like lose their business trouble. Noted, I said. "One more thing. Can you help me set up some wildlife cameras around the garden, just in case our culprit returns?" That afternoon, I went door to door around the neighborhood under the guise of bee safety awareness after the unfortunate incident. Most people were sympathetic, if a bit confused about why I cared so much. A few even seemed genuinely upset about the bees. Mrs. Rodriguez, 3 doors down from the willows, was watering her immaculate flower beds when I approached. "Oh, those poor bees," she said, shaking her head. "I heard what happened. Such a shame." "Did you notice anything unusual around the garden recently?" I asked. "Anyone who seemed bothered by the bees?" Mrs. Rodriguez glanced around and lowered her voice. "Well, I don't like to gossip, but Karen Willows has been on a tear about those bees for months. At the book club meeting, she said they were a liability waiting to happen, and that she'd take care of it if the HOA wouldn't." "When was this?" "Last Thursday. She was pretty worked up about it." I thanked her and continued my canvassing. 2 more neighbors mentioned Karen's complaints about the bees. Then I hit pay dirt with Jason, a teenager who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac. "Yeah, I saw Mrs. Willows near the garden the night before all the bees died," he said, glancing back toward his house to make sure his parents weren't listening. "I was walking my dog late. She had some kind of sprayer thing. I figured she was taking care of the roses or something." "What time was this exactly?" "Like 11? I was coming back from my girlfriend's." He gave me a panicked look. "Don't tell my parents." "Your secret's safe with me," I assured him. "Thanks for the info." By the time I finished my neighborhood rounds, it was nearly dinner time, and I had a pretty clear picture. Karen Willows had been vocally hostile toward the bees, had access to commercial pesticides, and had been seen near the garden with a sprayer the night before the massacre. The case was building, but I needed more. The next day, I set up the wildlife cameras with Marco's help and installed a new observation hive in my front window, visible from the street and, more importantly, from Karen's jogging route. I added a prominent sign: State Apiary Research Project, Monitoring in Progress. 2 days later, an emergency HOA meeting was called about the dangerous incident in the community garden. I arrived early, taking a seat in the front row with my laptop and a folder of documents. Karen walked in with Franklin, the board president, deep in conversation. She faltered slightly when she saw me, but quickly recovered, plastering on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I want to thank everyone for coming on such short notice," Franklin began once the room had filled. "As you may have heard, we had an unfortunate incident in the community garden involving the beehives. The bees appear to have died from some kind of poisoning, and we are here to discuss next steps." Karen raised her hand immediately. "If I may, I think we need to address the safety concern first. Whatever killed the bees, perhaps some kind of disease, could potentially affect residents, especially children who use the garden." I nearly laughed out loud at the audacity. "Actually," I said without waiting to be called on, "the bees didn't die from disease. They were poisoned with a commercial-grade neonicotinoid pesticide that's restricted for residential use. I've confirmed this through laboratory testing of samples taken from the site." Murmurs spread through the room. Karen's smile tightened. "Laboratory testing?" Franklin asked. "How did you arrange that so quickly?" I opened my laptop. "I work for the State Apiary Lab. I ran the tests myself." I turned the screen to show the chromatography results, knowing full well most people wouldn't understand them, but appreciating the official-looking graphs and charts. Karen's face went pale, then quickly flushed red. "Well, regardless of how they died, this proves beehives are too complicated and dangerous for a community garden. They should be removed immediately." For the next hour, the debate raged. Karen pushed for removal of even the empty hives, calling them eyesores and dangerous. I argued for replacement of the colonies and better security. In the end, the board compromised. The hive boxes could stay, but no newbies until the investigation was complete. In the parking lot after the meeting, Karen cornered me by my car. "I know what you're doing," she said, her voice low. "You're trying to make this personal." "I know what you did, Karen," I replied calmly. "The pesticide used on my hives is only available to licensed professionals." "I have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped. "Maybe you should spend less time with your bugs and more time with real people. Then you'd understand why no one wants those dangerous things in our neighborhood." She stormed off to her gleaming white SUV, leaving me wondering how someone could be so confident after committing such an obvious crime. The next evening, my doorbell rang around 7 p.m. When I opened the door, I was surprised to find Dave Willows standing on my porch, looking uncomfortable in jeans and a polo shirt with his company logo. "Hey, Mike," he said, shifting from foot to foot. "Got a minute to talk?" I invited him in, curious. Dave had always seemed like a generic suburban dad, coaching Little League, manning the grill at block parties, and generally fading into the background of neighborhood life. "Look," he began once we were seated in my living room, "I heard about what happened to your bees, and I think Karen might have been involved." "You think?" I raised an eyebrow. He sighed heavily. "Karen's been not herself lately. Ever since we moved here, she's been obsessed with making everything perfect. The house, the yard, her position on the board. She fixates on things she can't control. Like the beehives?" "Exactly. She's convinced they're bringing down our property value. She's a realtor, so she's always thinking about resale." I waited, letting the silence do the work. "I noticed some stuff missing from our inventory last week," Dave finally continued. "A sprayer and about half a gallon of Enforcer Pro. It's a restricted neonicotinoid we use for difficult wasp nests on commercial properties." "That would do it?" I said. "That's serious stuff, Dave. Your company could lose its license if it was used improperly." "I know." He rubbed his face. "That's why I'm here. I can't have my business jeopardized over this." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to me. "This is a copy of our purchase record for the pesticide. I've highlighted the lot number, if it matches what killed your bees." "It will," I said, already knowing. "The wildlife camera caught her returning to spray the empty hives 2 nights ago. I've already collected those samples too." Dave looked stricken. "Jesus, she's still doing it? I thought after all the talk about an investigation she'd back off." "People don't think rationally when they're fixated on something," I said. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. I love her, but this isn't normal behavior." He stood up to leave. "Just, if this goes further, can you make it clear I came forward voluntarily? The business is all I have." Over the next week, I put my plan into motion. I installed a beautiful new observation hive in my front window with a small colony I brought from the lab. I added more official-looking signs about state research and GPS-monitored colonies. The neighborhood kids were fascinated and started stopping by after school for impromptu bee education. Karen drove by my house at least 3 times a day, slowing each time to glare at the new hive. "Yes, these are special bees," I told a group of kids loudly one afternoon as her car crawled past. "We're tracking their movements with tiny transmitters. Very official government research." Then came the newspaper article. A former college classmate worked for the local paper, and I'd reached out about doing a feature on the lab's work. The resulting piece, Local Expert Heading State Bee Research Initiative, included a photo of me in full lab gear and mentioned the investigation into pesticide poisoning of research colonies. I made sure copies were delivered to every house in the neighborhood. The morning after the article ran, my doorbell rang at 7:30 a.m. Karen stood on my porch in yoga pants and a designer sweatshirt, her hair and makeup impeccable despite the early hour. "We need to talk," she said tightly. I let her in, curious to see her play. "There must be some misunderstanding," she began, perching on the edge of my couch. "I'm a huge supporter of the garden. I've always appreciated your work with the bees." "Really?" I pulled out my phone and played a recording from the HOA meeting. Karen's voice clear as day, calling the bees a menace and a liability. Her fake smile faltered. "Well, I was concerned about safety, naturally. Any responsible board member would be—" "Karen," I said, leaning forward, "let's cut the crap. I have you on camera spraying my hives. I have chemical analysis matching the pesticide to the exact lot number your husband's company purchased. And I have multiple witnesses who saw you near the garden the night the bees died." Her face went through a fascinating series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate indignation. "You can't prove anything," she said. "And even if you could, it was just bugs. It's not like I hurt a person." "Industrial-grade pesticide used without a license in a residential area is a federal offense," I replied. "Destruction of agricultural property is a state felony. And just bugs? Those colonies were part of an official state research program." That last part was a stretch. I'd only brought the new observation hive under the research umbrella after the attack. But Karen didn't need to know that. "Are you threatening me?" she demanded. "No, I'm informing you of the legal consequences of your actions. An official from the Agricultural Department will be collecting samples today. The police have been notified that we have identified the chemical agent and likely suspect." Karen stood up abruptly. "This isn't over. I have connections in this town. My clients include the mayor and 2 council members." "That's nice. My colleagues include the state's environmental prosecutor and the EPA regional director." I showed her to the door. "Have a nice day, Karen." She left in tears, already on her phone, presumably calling her lawyer. True to my word, that afternoon my colleague Jamal from the lab arrived in an official vehicle to collect additional samples. He was enjoying his role a bit too much, making a show of taking photographs and notes while wearing a jacket with the state seal emblazoned on the back. Karen watched from her porch the entire time, phone clutched in her hand. The police returned as well, and this time it wasn't Officer Jenkins but Detective Rodriguez, who took the matter considerably more seriously. "Sir, we've received the report from the Agricultural Department," she told me. "This is now a criminal investigation." 2 days later, a special HOA meeting was called. The energy in the room was electric. News of Karen's potential involvement had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. She arrived with a slick-looking lawyer in tow, while I brought Jamal and Detective Rodriguez. Franklin called the meeting to order, looking deeply uncomfortable. "We're here to discuss recent developments regarding the incident in the community garden." I presented the evidence methodically: camera footage, chemical analysis, witness statements, and finally Dave Willow's testimony about the missing pesticide. Karen's lawyer kept whispering urgently in her ear, clearly advising her to stay quiet. But halfway through my presentation, she couldn't contain herself anymore. "Those bees were a nuisance," she burst out. "No one wanted them here except him. I was protecting our property values." The room went silent. Her lawyer closed his eyes in defeat. "Karen Willows," Detective Rodriguez said, standing up, "you have the right to remain silent." The aftermath was both swift and far-reaching. Karen was charged with criminal destruction of property, improper use of restricted pesticides, and environmental violations. Dave filed for divorce the following week, his statement to police having been the final straw in what was apparently an already strained marriage. The HOA board unanimously voted to remove Karen and issue a formal apology to me. More surprisingly, they also approved funding for an expanded community garden and educational apiary. A neighborhood fundraiser to restore the Beehives exceeded its goal within days. People who had never shown interest before were suddenly passionate supporters of our bees. Marco and his crew built a beautiful new apiary structure with observation windows for the kids. You know, he told me as we installed the new hives, I never gave a damn about bees before, but what she did was just wrong, man. And watching you with all these kids, teaching them about how important bees are. It's pretty cool. 6 months later, the garden was thriving with twice as many hives as before. I was running weekend beekeeping classes for residents, and the HOA had created a new environmental committee with me as chairperson. The real estate listings for the neighborhood now prominently featured the award-winning community garden with expert-led apiary as a selling point. I was checking the mail one evening when a moving truck pulled up to the Willow's former house. Karen had been renting it out since the divorce was finalized, but apparently it had finally sold. To my surprise, she stepped out of a car parked behind the truck. "Collecting the last of my things," she said stiffly when she saw me. "Don't worry, I'll be gone in an hour." I nodded and turned to go. "You ruined my life, you know," she called after me. I turned back. "No, Karen, you did that all by yourself. The bees were just innocent bystanders." "I'm appealing my case," she said, "and suing you for defamation." "Good luck with that." I smiled. "By the way, how's community service at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center going? I hear they have a whole section on pollinator conservation." She stormed past me without another word. The following weekend, we held our first annual Honey Harvest Festival in the garden. Families milled about in the autumn sunshine, kids wearing little bee antennae headbands, adults sampling honey from our different hives. As I walked around, I overheard a realtor talking to a prospective buyer. The community garden and apiary add at least $15K to home values in this development. It's been featured in Suburban Living magazine. I smiled to myself and walked toward the special memorial hive we'd installed at the edge of the garden. It had a small plaque. "In memory of Colony 4, who gave their lives but saved our garden." Looking at the new bees settling into their hives and the community that had rallied around them, I couldn't help but think Karen had been right about one thing. These bees definitely changed the neighborhood, just not the way she expected. Some people might say my response to Karen's attack was excessive. Maybe it was. But in my defense, she killed thousands of innocent creatures out of pure spite. And if there's one thing you learn from working with bees, it's that sometimes you have to use your stinger to protect the hive.